Welcome to Robot Unicorn. We are so glad that you are here. As always, let's start the show with a question from Scott.
We are going to talk about screens today. And screens seem to be one of the many controversial parenting topics, I think. And I will say, screens it's probably kind of for good reason, but I do think the discussion needs a little bit more nuance than, I don't know, you see Instagram or TikTok accounts talking about how you should have literally zero screen time. And I just think that's due to a lack of understanding of like child development. So it's, in my opinion, screens are not necessarily a bad thing, but it is our use of screens and our lack of boundaries around them, just essentially letting your kids be on screens all the time, that is the problem. So it has nothing to do with the screens themselves. Some of the content, yes, that they can watch is a problem. But if a parent is actively... Anyways, we'll get into this, but I think
I feel like end the episode right there.
Yeah. So my question for you is screen time as terrible as they, in quotes, they say?
I think you already answered my question in the fact that there needs to be a nuance that's brought to the discussion, right? It's not, is screen time terrible or not?
Okay, well then if you agree with me.
Yeah.
It's the first time ever. I feel
Shocking.
Shocking, yeah. If you agree with my statements there, then I think let's break it down into what makes screen time, let's say, quote unquote, bad, and what can make it good or better. And should there be any rules or, I don't know, let's go through it that way.
Yeah,
where we
I like
talk
that.
About,
if screen time takes away from a child's ability to play, have open-ended play, and a child's ability to have time with you without the screen there, if the screen is replacing those two things, then screen time is a problem. I think that's what the nuance that needs to be brought in, right? There's lots of people who will give their kids tons of time to play, right? Like, let's say a Saturday, kids maybe they watch an hour of screen Saturday morning TV. Then the whole rest of the day, the kids are playing, they're outside, they're having fun, you're spending time with them, even doing household chores. And then, it's 6:00 and we're going to eat pizza and watch a movie together at night. And then maybe we even watch a second movie and the kids go to bed, right? In that scenario, screen time's not taking away from a child's chance to play, to learn, to explore the world, and it's not taking away from a child's time with you. In fact, at night when you're watching the screen with your child, you're even spending more time together, right? So in that scenario, it's not taking it away. And the reverse, let's say you have a Saturday and your kids are just sitting in front of the TV the entire Saturday, all day. Maybe they're playing games on their computer or their iPad or their devices, or they have your phone and they're scrolling through YouTube. That would be a different story. Not if it's once in a while, like you have a hard day, but if that's the consistent routine, every single Saturday, they're just on screens all day, then we might want to talk about that being a challenge. Would you agree with that?
I think so. And the research would agree with that as well. So in preparation for this, I looked into a bunch of news articles, research articles, and I found some interesting articles. Like one New York Post article I found talked about the Swedish government saying that children under 2 should not use screens at all. And then from 2 to 5, it should be less than an hour or up to an hour. From 6 to 12, it's less than or equal to 2 hours. So like they get a little bit more. And what they have been finding is that by the time kids are in the 13 to 16-year-old range in Sweden, they're already on their devices after school time, like outside of school time, they're on their devices for 6.5 hours a day.
Wow.
And in the US, apparently, according to this New York Post article, kids in that same age range, so the 13 to 16, are on their devices for about 8.5 hours outside of, on average, 8.5 hours outside of school time.
Yeah, so that's over a whole working day period of time.
So at first, when we discussed this topic and wanting to discuss it on the podcast, I didn't really get it, like what the point of it is, because it seems very foreign to me. Like, this seems like a normal thing. You don't give your kids too much screen time, and if you do, you should be present and you should be knowing what they're watching. Mm-hmm. But I can see why this is a discussion. If this is truly the amount of hours that kids by that age are on their devices, that I can see huge negative effects from that.
Yeah, and I would say that's what I was trying to explain to you in our podcast prep meeting on this, because in our work as therapists, we see this a lot. And we see a lot of parents feeling confused, feeling unsure, and really struggling, because what happens is when you start allowing your child to take the reins on the screen time, they'll continue to want more and more and more.
Yeah, right.
Right? And if you're not setting the boundaries with a child, like I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day. My friend is like very much on board with the style of parenting we teach here, but she had given her 4-year-old a Nintendo Switch. Or sorry, not 4, I think he's 6. Her 6-year-old a Nintendo Switch. And basically thought to herself, he should be able to regulate the amount of time. Like, so she didn't put a boundary in place. So on Saturdays and Sundays, when he was home from school, she would say, yeah, on Saturdays and Sundays, you can play the Switch. Well, her son couldn't regulate himself. And she started to realize she has multiple kids. And it kind of went unnoticed at first that every single time he had the Switch, it would be more and more and more time that he would play, to the point where he would never get off on his own terms. It was always her.
Yeah.
And to the point where then the entire weekend, all he's doing is asking to play the Switch at 6. And she was like, I realized that if I didn't step in and intervene, this would just take over all of his spare time. And that's at 6. And I think that's what a lot of parents are facing and struggling with right now.
Yeah, which I understand. And I think most people don't actually understand the fact that social media, let's say Nintendo Switch, whatever, or other gaming systems of all kinds, are legitimately designed to reward you for playing or
Yes.
using them. Mm-hmm. They use, intermittent reinforcement. So you're not always getting it at the same time. Like, social media is legitimately the best example of that. If you post something and something goes viral and you get a whole bunch of likes and comments and whatever, like, you get tons of engagement, but it doesn't happen all the time. Mm-hmm. You're going to be searching out that feeling constantly for, I want this to happen. I want to show people things so that I get this. And it's like, in the end, those things are kind of meaningless, but it's gamified.
Yeah.
Even social media. And the reason they say it's gamified is because games are similar. They are, like, some of the games that I've played on the Nintendo, you can tell that they have designed them so that you want to search out things and spend more time playing the game and being immersed in the world. And you don't always get cool items when you're playing. Mm-hmm. You will get them intermittently. And it reinforces your brain to be like, oh, I need to check this thing out, even though I know in reality, there's probably nothing there that's of value to me in this game. Mm-hmm. I need to check it out, because what if it's
there is
good?
something.
Yeah.
And then if you get that something, then it's that hit of like, ooh, okay, now I want to find more.
Yeah. So I think it's an misunderstanding of parents, both of, like, thinking these companies have our best interest, like a family's best interest at heart. Mm-hmm. The reality is, a social media company, they want to make their billions of dollars.
Yeah.
They are going to play within whatever limits they have set out for them. And if there are no limits, then they're going to, like, truly, any social media company that comes out and says, we're limiting like the amount of time that a teen spends on our account, I think that is this form of virtue signaling. And I don't truly think that they care that much. They want to look better, but the truthfully, the best thing that they could do is say no one under this certain age
Should have it.
should be even allowed on here because it's so addicting.
Yeah.
And that's for all screens. Like, that's how a lot of content is created. So we have to, as parents, be wary of what is out there and try and monitor what our kids are, even up to like later teens as well. I truly think that you can't rely on a child who's still developing, even if they seem older and they're acting more like an adult. Their brain is designed like, these companies are, let's say, hacking our brains, what we know about developmental psychology, to
Get your kid hooked.
not even your kids, but us. So if we as parents have a hard time getting off of it, how can we expect our child?
That's what I was just thinking the whole time you're talking. I was thinking about, we've talked about this in previous podcasts, but I wouldn't say that you had like a gaming addiction, but when
I probably did at one point.
Right. Oh yeah, so maybe. I mean, that's up to you to say or not, but when you were gaming, it would be very hard for you to get off of it, even in adulthood, right? And it'd be like you would feel like, I have to get back on it. And then it would kind of consume all the things. And that's you as an adult, right? And it'd be like, okay, Scott, like, really, we should go to bed, right? And it'd be hard to, oh, just one more game, or I just want to finish this level, or I just want to do this. And I think about that for our kids. And a lot of like kids, youth, teens, preteens, they're playing games, and I don't think all games are terrible and evil, but
No.
I can see that even in kids that we've observed, that it pulls you in, and I think as parents we can say, well, it's their social time because their friends are on there, or they're talking to other people while they're playing their game, and I think it's easy for us, and I'm not saying this to shame parents, but just to like help us understand, right? It's like easy for us to be like, oh, well, there's reasons why they play this, or they don't like other things. And I think we have to sometimes take a step back and really look like, is this helping our child long term?
I think it's a both and type situation where both the companies that put these products out there, they are trying to maximize the amount of money that they're making for their shareholders, for themselves. And we as parents need to also at the same time understand that that's their goal. Mm-hmm. So then we have to be a little more cautious, I think, of how we use all the different devices, all the different games. And like, I think it's an important thing. We have to be just wary of it and constantly be thinking, does this help my child? Is this going to help my child in the long run doing this? Or do we need to make a change?
Yeah.
So I think it's a both and situation where both the company is trying to draw you in and your children in, and also we as parents need to fight back against that.
I really had this word in my head. I was telling you about this earlier, Scott, of protect. And it's my word for myself for the new year, and also my word for what I want to do and help parents do with their kids. And I think when it comes to screens and games and all that kind of stuff, social media, we really need to protect our kids. And we need to know that our kids, all the way up to being teens, like, they are going to want more screens. That's exactly what the screens are designed to do. That's what we've been saying, right? Yeah. And so our job as parents is to like note that they're going to want that, but we need to create the rules, and we need to decide what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, sometimes with our kids' input, and take the lead on that, and not put our kids in that leadership position. Because if we put the kids in the lead, it's way too much responsibility for them. And also they're probably going to choose more screens. Like, even with our daughter, our 8-year-old,
yeah,
I know that
she would always choose
she would always choose more screens. She loves screens.
And I understand. That's one of those things that I disagree with you slightly on. The whole concept of it's too much responsibility for them.
Yeah.
Like, they're too young to even to be a concept in my mind. They don't get that responsibility yet. You slowly like allow them to wade into the waters of responsibility, but it's not even a question. It shouldn't be a question of like, I don't know, our 8-year-old
Being responsible
being
for that.
responsible for anything in her life at this point, really. Yes, there are certain things that she's slowly learning to be responsible for, like getting herself dressed and making sure that she's brushing her teeth. But even that, it's a slight inconvenience for her day. So we're going to have to remind her. So we're still the responsible one. So that is something that I know you say it's too much responsibility for them. But I just think
So
that
maybe
shouldn't even be in anyone's mind that it's too much responsibility for them because they're too young to even have that.
responsibility.
Yeah.
I actually fully agree with you. I think,
I think you're just saying it in a nice way.
I'm just saying it in a nicer way. But when I was at the conference with Dr. Gordon Neufeld, and he was talking a little bit about screens, like the conversation came up amongst all the therapists there. And what we were saying is like, we assume that at like 8, 9, like our kids should take on some of this responsibility, like exactly what you're saying. But our kids need us to be fully in charge, right? And
Yeah.
fully be the leader. And I think that's something that is maybe a belief that a lot of people have is like they seem older. Like even our daughter seems older, like, oh, she should be able to like handle this now. Or like my friend with her 6-year-old, like, oh, I thought he would just be able to regulate himself. But like we need to remember who we're dealing with.
Yeah. To me, that doesn't, I don't know, I have a hard time understanding how that is the case. Like, I get it. Our expectations of them are, hey, this is the real world. You have to figure this out. But again, they are never in charge of screens or games because they would literally spend the whole day. And if me as an adult would probably do the same thing if I had the level of responsibility that they had.
You just say it. You are more, I feel like you just say it how it is. I'm trying to like say things nicely, but I think
That takes so much longer to discuss.
you can choose to consume it from my angle or Scott's angle,
Yeah.
but we're saying the exact same thing, which is children should not be put in charge of screens.
Yeah. And like in my opinion, screens are, and this is every type of screen, are only bad if they aren't monitored by parents and they're used all the time. So it's both of those things. If they are monitored by parents and they're not used constantly, like they actually spend time playing outside and reading books.
Yeah, the thing I talked about at the
like-
beginning, right?
Like doing other things that allow their brains to not be consumed by something that almost feels like you're being productive. Like, let's say for me, if I go on Reddit and I'm looking at 3D printing stuff or Formula One stuff, it almost makes my brain feel productive, but I know that it's not actually productive for me. If there's a certain reason for me to go on there, like I'm setting up this home automation system and I need to know how this specific peripheral device integrates with the rest of it and how to program it, then yeah, it's useful. But otherwise, I'm just like, I'm consuming information for no real reason. And I think that is the problem with screens of all kind, is that if it's not monitored by parents and you're allowing your kids kind of untethered access to everything for pretty much as long as they want, then yes, screens are a problem and you shouldn't let your kids use it. And I think that's where a lot of the the people on social media talk about you shouldn't let your kids under 2 be on screens. Like, yeah, of course, you shouldn't if you're just going to use it as your TV babysitter.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like there's this like fantasy ideal world where, yeah, we never use a screen and everything is sepia toned and the kids always play. And I feel like that's a lot of what's on social media right now, right? Like I just saw a post legitimately like this morning. It was like, my kids play for 5 straight hours without whining and crying because I taught them how to not use a screen. It's like, okay, so that might be true. And I think we need to have compassion for parents who are like, no, I do use the screen with my 3-year-old sometimes, and find that balance, like you said, the and. So can you paint a picture or can you kind of show how you would use screens with our girls in a way that feels healthy to you?
I think it's pretty much mostly the way we use it now. Sometimes, of course, we're not perfect, so we're using it probably more than we should at times. But I think for the most part, what we do is it's structured. So they get home from school, they're not allowed to be on screens right away, and they're only allowed for a certain period before we have dinner. And it's very structured, and we know exactly what they're watching. Like, I'm not even a fan of them watching YouTube because literally anything can pop up. And I just don't like the idea of it playing the next thing. And you, as a parent,
You don't know.
if you're not there
I kind of
right next to them.
Yeah, I wanted to get into like those types of things also. I think we should talk about that.
But I mean, they're like lately they've been into this show, Gabby's Dollhouse, which I think is, from what I understand, quite popular.
Yeah, a lot of people watch it.
Which, hey, makes sense. It's a very well designed show. They love cats, so then the whole show has a bunch of random cats with dumb names. But
All three girls are obsessed with kitty cats, so
I feel like it's a pretty positive, uplifting show in general. And the main actress on it, like, she seems to be also positive and uplifting the whole time. And so I don't have a problem with that. But we've already vetted that show. And if there is any time that we don't spend with them watching it, it's on that. So it's on a show that we've already pre-vetted that we're okay with. So even sometimes we'll throw on Mr. Rogers instead, which, just because of nostalgic reasons, we love to watch that too.
yeah, we like that one.
But I also think like slower paced shows. So things that we typically like, the shows that are, I don't know, teach them a craft or
To have like a slow lesson.
yeah. It's not changing shots constantly. So every like 2 to 3 seconds, like Cocomelon does.
Cocomelon was a show that we had to cut out.
Yeah.
Yeah, we realized that.
Oh, it puts them into a trance when they're watching it.
Yeah, our middle daughter, it was put on by a babysitter and she got into it and she would just ask for it like constantly.
Yeah.
And she was in a trance when she would watch it and she was only 2 and we're just like, you know what? We don't like how this impacts you. So we're going to cut this show out. And I think that's our job again as parents. Like, okay, we're noticing that when you watch this show, you're not the best version of yourself before or after. That's our job to be like, okay, no more Cocomelon. And then deal with the consequences of her being mad about that, which was a lot of tantrums.
Which she was not pleased
right?
about. But
I
like,
think,
we try to make it as educational as possible too, when we can. Not always, of course. Like, again, we're not perfect.
we're not perfect at this.
We're not trying to say this as though like we're doing things exactly the way they should be.
And we have like screen time in our house. It's not, we definitely are not the family that's no screens, right? I think one thing that we do well in the last year or so, and that I would suggest to parents too, is we have like little rituals around a lot of the screens that they watch, right? Like the after school, it's like come home, do your homework, empty your lunch bag, have a snack. Okay, and then a certain amount of time before dinner, you can watch your show.
Yeah. Well, and they're usually playing a bit first, and then after they've played with their dolls and all that for a bit, then we put on the show, and then
you can get dinner ready and all that, right?
Oftentimes they're not even finished the episode before it's time to
have dinner.
Yeah.
And then before our littlest goes to bed, she goes to bed pretty late. She has a nap still. She'll watch a little calm show before bed.
Yeah.
And then on Friday nights, we have movie night. And we will order takeout. Often we throw a huge sheet on the floor in our living room and we all sit and have like a picnic dinner and watch a movie. And Saturday nights, usually same thing. Right? So there's some ritual around it, which I think is good that the kids know when to expect to watch TV. Another thing I would say that I am very focused on is I never turn the TV on to regulate the kids' emotions.
Yes, because that's very easy. I think a very easy thing to do. Like, here's an iPad or something like that.
And sometimes you want to, right?
Yeah.
Like we joke.
I know, it's very tempting to
We're
do
just
that.
like, oh, I know she would stop crying if I just threw on Gabby's Dollhouse for a minute. But that's very important to us to make sure that we are helping them regulate. We help them get back to a state of calm-ish. Like maybe they're not, like they're still tired, they're not 100% calm. But when they ask for the TV to calm themselves down, the answer is always no.
Yeah, I don't even think that's an expectation from them at this point.
No.
I think they know that we're never going to put the TV on now if they're crying or upset or whatever.
And maybe I would have times. I'm just thinking back to like when we had like a newborn baby
Yeah.
and a toddler. And that's the other thing I want to say about screens too. Like, listen, I'm pretty sure my oldest watched Frozen 2 every single day for an entire year,
Yep.
at least once. And that was COVID, and we had a second baby. And she still had time for playing. She still had time with me, so don't guilt yourself if your kid's watching a movie a day, because that's the season of life and that's the only way you can get your baby down for a nap, right? Like that's where the nuance comes in.
I think the key is, and like I read a lit review on the effects of excessive screen time on child development. And of course, it's all the things that we've talked about. There's lots of negative impacts for excessive screen time. It's not as though any screen time is bad. It's just excessive screen time. So the guidelines that I was explaining before that the Swedish government put in place, like children under 2 shouldn't use screens. From 2 to 5, you can have maybe up to an hour. From 6 to 12, up to 2 hours. Those are just guidelines. But like, it's all about using some reasoning and logic to figure out, like, yeah, if you're noticing your kid is more irritable or aggressive, or like a lot of the negative impacts that watching too much screens or playing too many video games does, then okay, let's limit more than what we're doing right now.
And each kid might have different tolerance, right? Like, you have a sensitive kid and they're watching a show with like tons of bells and whistles and things are like the Coco Melon with our sensitive kid. You might notice that show doesn't work for them.
Right. Well, and because of that, it's kind of the lowest, the lowest common denominator. I don't know if that's the right term, but I think we base the amount of screen time on the child with the least tolerance. So they all get the same amount of screen time, but we just base it on whoever has the least amount of tolerance. That's who we base it on.
Yeah.
One thing or two things, I guess, that they said in this lit review, because I don't want to paint screens as all bad, but basically what they said is there are significant educational benefits if parents monitor what's being consumed. So there are actual benefits to using screens, and they can aid in language development and emotional regulation and like a lot of different things. But again, it has to be through you as a parent or caregiver monitoring what your child is actually consuming, limiting like too much of it, too much of a good thing.
I think that a lot of debates on social media are around that specific fact. Like on one side, people are like, screen times are great. My child watched such and such a show and they know the whole alphabet and they can count to 100. And then people on the other side will be like, yeah, that's great, but can your child get themselves off a screen? Do they still have time to play? Do they still have time to be with you? Right. So I think that fact is where there's a lot of polarization. And again, it's the nuance. Like, yes, learning facts is great, but if your toddler then doesn't have a chance to play and spend quality time with you and be outside, it's not so great, right? So again, it's the balance.
Right, and I think there's a misunderstanding of, again, the development of humans in general. Like the first bunch of years, I don't like, truthfully, being an engineer, you would think that I would want our children to know how to count super high or be able to do math right away at a super young age.
Yeah.
But in conversations with you and trying to understand better the development of humans, it's actually not better that they do that. Yeah. It ends up likely making them less creative, which is a huge skill, and likely making them less emotionally intelligent.
I always say I'm less impressed that your toddler can count to 50 than I am the fact that your toddler can make up imaginary worlds and pretend to be a kitty cat and play
or say to you, I'm feeling sad.
Yeah, or say to you, I'm feeling sad, or come to you for a giant hug when they do feel sad, right? Those are the things that I'm like, okay, this is good. Yeah.
Because the counting and reading and all that kind of stuff, that will come.
Yeah.
It's not as though they'll be behind because they don't. And they might be ahead for a little while. but then other kids are going to catch up too.
Yeah, and I think parents feel this pressure of like, oh my goodness, there's all these options for me to teach my kids how to learn to count to 50, and my toddler could do it, so they should.
Yep.
Right? And like, take that pressure off yourself. Like, you don't have to put your child on a screen so they can learn how to count to 50. Right? Like,
Yeah.
If that's the reason that you're putting them on a screen because you're like, oh, I want them to be able to learn to keep up with my friend who has a toddler who counts to 100 or whatever, right?
Yeah.
That's not what toddlerhood is about. And there's a lot of people that will put out shows and content and stuff like that to teach your kids all these things and sure they can learn it. But like you said, will that take away from their ability to be creative and play and like do the things that actually are the job of the toddler years?
Or like we've talked about, learning, say, natural consequences. So you go out and you run too fast in your yard and you fall and you scrape your knee or something like that. You've learned something in that. You've gotten physical exercise because you're outside playing. You're out in the outdoors. But you've also learned something about, like, oh, in this area of the yard, maybe there's a hole in the yard and I don't want to run there or something like that. Or like you're learning things as you're doing that too.
Yeah.
As kids get older, there's lots of schoolwork that they're going to have to do. So they're going to catch up on that. Not even catch up. They're going to
I see that in our preschooler who's in JK right now, right? We didn't really prioritize teaching her math or numbers or anything like that before going to JK. We really prioritized like free play with her, but she's catching on to it so quick and she can already do basic math and it didn't take long. Right. And so, yeah, maybe some of her peers knew those things before going in, but they end up all kind of being at the same spot. Right. So don't stress yourself out over that. And I would say to parents, like, still see that as a show, right? Just because it's educational doesn't mean it's like, okay, now they can watch it for 4 hours.
Right.
Right? Like, it's still a show. What we would do is, like, if I needed to put a show on, I would do a lot of, like, baby sign language for our toddler. Yeah. And so that was educational. She learned how to do baby sign language, which was pretty cool. But I still viewed that as a show, right? So there were still limits on how long she watched it, how I was watching it with her, all of those things. Yeah.
So the last thing I will say about the research that I found on this is the 3 main things that they want you to look out for, that you should look out for as a parent, are the context in which you're watching something. Mm-hmm. So again, you don't necessarily want to use it as something to help regulate their emotion. I also think that this is also, you're going to a restaurant, you don't give your child an iPad when you're at the restaurant to keep them calm, like they're a child. So I think expecting normal child behaviors in a restaurant.
Just like a greater societal issue, I feel like in Canada and the US, like we don't expect kids to act like kids in restaurants here. Yeah. Whereas I feel like when we went to Europe or like Portugal and the Netherlands, like they expect children to be kids in restaurants and they have like little play spots for them. I think a lot of the reasons that we give kids iPads in restaurants is because we like have this greater pressure to be like,
kind of like
quiet.
I would agree with that. The second thing is the quality of the content that the child is consuming, which the only way for you to know is for you as a parent or caregiver to actually watch with them and understand what they're watching. So I think that also means that you cannot give them untethered, like they shouldn't be allowed to watch whatever YouTube shorts they want, right? That's not something that they should be allowed to ever do, or go on TikTok and scroll TikTok on their own. You can't know what they're watching on there if they're doing that. So I just think based on this, you shouldn't be allowing that because you don't know the quality of the content that they're watching.
Can I ask you a question that might be a can of worms so we can cut this?
Sure.
What do you think about like shooter games for kids? Because I know a lot of kids are playing that.
Shooter games?
Yeah, like games where there's like shooting and...
It probably depends on the type. So I would say, like I played Call of Duty. Was I a kid at that point or was I...
I feel like you started as a kid, maybe, or like
I can't remember.
older,
I was like older
teen, maybe.
teen, yeah, when I started playing that. I don't know. On one hand, I love those kind of games, but I don't play them anymore because.
That's why I'm asking. Yeah.
So I don't play them anymore, mostly because they made me far more aggressive when I was playing them. Because I would, yeah, it's just for whatever reason, it feels like it's high stakes when you're playing it.
Yeah. It gets your adrenaline pumping.
Yeah. So I just became a more aggressive version of myself. So it was not a good thing for me to play. So even like even into the pandemic, I was playing and I was using it as like social time with friends. But I would leave the night playing the game feeling pissed off rather than having had fun.
I remember looking at you like, how is this decompression, right? But I'm just thinking about that for our kids. I was like talking to someone whose son plays that kind of game, and they were asking me like what you would think about it.
What I would think?
Yeah.
So, yeah, based on even being an adult playing it and feeling that aggressive feeling, I would have a hard time saying, like, allowing our girls to do it. So, yeah, I would probably not recommend it.
Yeah.
Just based on how I know it makes me feel when I play it. I just get so engrossed in the game and it feels so high stakes. And, yeah, the adrenaline is pumping through my veins. My heart's racing when I'm playing it. And then I end up getting pissed off because I mean, I'm getting older, so my reflexes are worse.
It's just not, yeah. Do you think that there's like a piece for that type of game or like fighting games or shooting games of like normalizing kind of the aggression in the games? Like I can't remember what I read, but like kids who play games or like watch that kind of show have seen like X amount of deaths by the time they're 13 or something. Like,
I mean,
what do you think about that?
I have a hard time seeing that because when you're playing the game, it's not as though it feels real.
Right. Do you feel like you can differentiate that between
100%.
real life?
Even something as realistic looking as Call of Duty is now. Mm-hmm. I'm not going in there thinking, yeah, I just shot like 10 people or 10 people shot me and it's like a real death that's occurring. Like it's a game. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think it's so gamified and like every aspect of it. You're just looking at the points and your ratio to see how well you're playing the game. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, I personally don't see that.
But the aggression.
But the aggression, just because of how it makes you, it gets your adrenaline pumping. You're like, let's say in the one game, it's a huge open world. You're in there with potentially 150 other people, and you're kind of sneaking around. It's like you could be playing a game of capture the flag or something like that with 150 other people.
Yeah.
So you have to try and sneak around the map without being seen, and only to see other people. And then you get into a firefight in the game with someone else.
Yeah.
Like you are trying to sneak around, so your heart is racing, seeing this person pop out from a building or something like that, and then you have to get them, and then they turn around and get you instead, and then it pisses you off because
right. So imagine being
it.
like a 12-year-old boy playing that without like a limit on how long you're playing that, right? And then you're supposed to get off and like go to school the next day.
So that's why I would say, for myself, I would not recommend it for kids.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's valid. I feel like you speak from not only having done the research, but from your own experience.
Yeah, just knowing how it makes me feel.
Yeah. I think if you go back to like the word protect, like it is really protecting your kids to set those limits, even if they're mad about it.
Yeah, right.
I don't think your kid's going to someday be like, oh, I wish you let me play more of Call of Duty when I was 10, right? But they might, if you don't have that boundary, be like, I couldn't regulate myself on Call of Duty and I needed someone to help me out with that. Or YouTube Shorts or TikTok or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I will say, like, with our oldest daughter, and starting with our middle daughter as well, there are times where I'll play video games with our oldest daughter for 2 hours. But I'm sitting right next to her and we're playing, like, Mario Brothers. and we're talking the entire time about how we're going to get to the end of the level together. And
There's connection there.
yeah, she's like snuggled up against me and we're playing with each other and we're talking the whole time. So I think that's it's not high stakes.
It's Super Mario, yeah.
Yeah, it's not like either of us have our adrenaline running through our blood. Like,
And there's that connection piece, right? Like,
yeah,
I think of the other thing about gaming specifically, like, and all screens, especially if your child's maybe just watching it on an iPad or your phone by themselves, is it can be like an isolation as well. That feels like connection because they're seeing something on the screen, someone's talking to them, right? But it's fake connection.
yeah,
And it's not going to get your child's need for connected time met. And it might wire them to seek the screens as a way to get that need filled instead of seeking you. So that's another thing we just want to be mindful of.
yeah. And that was one of the key items in that literature review or research review that I read. Was that screens can make language skills in children, like younger children, worse unless they watch or do whatever they're doing on the screen with an adult next to them or with a caregiver next to them. And I think it's important to differentiate. Like sometimes when we're sometimes bad at that, where we'll allow the kids to watch and then we'll both be on our phones.
What are we doing? We're scrolling on our own phones.
So then that doesn't count. That's like they're not watching with an adult. So what the research says is that it can actually improve language skills if you're sitting with your child watching a show and you're discussing it together. You're helping them understand what's going on. And I hadn't even read this yet when I was watching a show with our youngest. And I was noticing that I was just sitting with her in the chair. We were watching the show and I was talking to her about it. And I was like, what do you think that's going to be? And then she would guess what it is, like something on the screen. And we were chatting back and forth. And I realized, I'm like, she understands quite a bit about this show.
Yeah.
But we just never discuss
The show.
these things.
Oh, I was doing the same thing last night.
So that is one thing. Like, again, it's not all bad. That can actually be a great way of doing two things, connecting and improving language skills or emotional, like understanding the emotions of others. I noticed our middle child is really doing that lately. She's drawing pictures of faces and different emotions, and
she's really recognizing emotions.
And she's starting to recognize that on TV if we're watching it too.
Well, I remember when remember how I said I watched Frozen 2 every day for a year? And it was like my only downtime basically. And I remember I would just like lay there nursing the baby, and the oldest, that's the only thing she wanted to watch. But I would often say things to her like, oh, do you notice Anna's face right now? Like, is she smiling? What is she doing? Or, oh, do you see Elsa? How do you think she feels? And I actually taught her a lot about emotions just through co-watching Frozen 2 with her. And I feel like she really got to understand emotions and what different people say and think, because I would just kind of narrate out the show while she was watching. So there can be opportunity there too. If you're like, guys, I need to have my TV time for a break, right? Like maybe there's some ways that you can build in that connection time as you watch it.
When in doubt, put an episode of Mr. Rogers on.
Yeah. I talked to our oldest about Frozen like a little while ago. She's like, Mom, I hate Frozen. It's so boring. And I was like, okay. I said, what if, because her sisters wanted to watch it all the time now. I said, what if you thought about it as, remember how we watched it every day together for a year? What if you thought about it as like, oh, I remember watching that with Mom and it was so fun and cozy, and maybe your sisters want to have that same opportunity. And she was like, oh, I guess I could think about Frozen different. And then the next time she was watching Frozen, she like snuggled up next to me. And then I said to her, I'm like, I bet you anything, when you go off to university, if you're feeling sad or lonely one night, you're going to pop on Frozen 2 and think about Mom.
Yeah.
Right? She was like, I think I'd like that. And so I think that
she will be like that.
There can be like memories made and bonding time through shows too, right? And same, like I bet you when she's off someday on her own, she'll be like reminiscing on playing Super Mario with you, and maybe she'll want to bring that to school and play that with her friends as a way to feel connected to home, right? So it's not all created equal. It's not all bad.
No, there's good things about it. It's
Yeah.
just, it involves, like I was talking about, the research says context,
Yeah.
quality, and parental involvement. Those are the three main things that make screen time good.
Yeah.
If you don't have those things, then it's more likely that it will be a negative.
Yeah. And remember, you're in charge, like Scott said so bluntly. I think about kids who want phones and they want iPads, their own, and they want to have a screen in their bedroom. And they want you to not look at what they're doing, right? All of these things kids are going to want. They're not bad for wanting it, but you have to take the lead on saying, you know what? The only screen we have is our family computer that's in the kitchen, right? So you can go on that, but we're going to be around. We're going to be seeing what you're doing.
All right, I have a part 2, though.
Okay.
So this is kind of related to that.
Okay.
So I'm going to assume that if you're listening to this episode right now, you probably mostly agree with what we're saying. Maybe not. If not, let us know. We have no problem with that. But let's just assume that if you're listening, you agree. I think the number one question that people will have is, okay, that's all wonderful, but what if other parents have different rules, or other kids have to abide by completely different rules, and your kids are around these other kids? So like, let's say our oldest sits next to someone on the bus who is allowed a phone.
Yeah.
They're in grade 3 and they have a phone, which it's a whole separate topic and is completely ridiculous to me that someone of that age has a phone, but
It's common.
it is becoming more common. So what should we as parents do if our kids are hanging out with, or just in the presence of, another child who's young, who doesn't really know how to regulate themselves, and they have complete access to a mobile device like that without any parental involvement or anything? So what should we as parents do with our own children in that case?
I think there's a few layers of protection. Like, if we can, I was talking to someone about this and they're like, I had to stop sending my kid to their friend's house because I know when they go there, their friend has a computer in their room and they're just on it the entire time. And my child told me that they were watching stuff with swearing and bad words and just bad things. And I don't feel comfortable sending them there. So now we're the house, right? So there's that. And I think it's okay. That is a healthy boundary. And also something that that person did really well is she had those conversations with her kids before they ever went to a friend's house. So they had conversations about, like, you know, I want you to tell me if when you go to your friend's house, if you guys are watching YouTube, or if you see anything with bad words, or anything that has people that are not wearing clothes, or games where you're shooting people. Like, I want you to let me know. Even if you play them, you won't be in trouble, but I want to be able to talk about that with you. And her child was able to have that conversation with her.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of, like, we can do proactive work, and we are the ones having those discussions with our kids. Even with our daughter, with the peer on the bus who has the phone, and she told us this peer would be Googling stuff on the bus ride. I said to her, you know, if you can, try and avoid looking at the phone. You don't know what's going to pop up, and we just don't want you to see anything that's not going to be safe for you to see. So I bought her a journal, and I said, why don't you try and do your own doodling or read a book or something like that instead. It's going to be hard. Like, she's still going to be tempted, of course, to look and see. But trying to equip them by having those conversations ahead of time is helpful. And also trying to protect them if you can, right? So if you know that this is going to be a situation that's not going to be safe for them, how can you, as a parent, step in and be like, well, then we're not going to go there, or we're not going to do that, or you're not going to be alone with this person.
Yeah.
That's your job, not your child's job to be like with a whole bunch of friends and be like, oh, I guess we're watching this now because I feel pressured because all my friends are watching it, right?
Yeah, and that's likely a conversation that you don't have just once.
Yeah.
You have it many times.
Yeah, we're at that age with our oldest now where we're constantly having this screen time discussion, right? And I know there'll be times where she does watch something that she shouldn't, right? And because the temptation to watch it, if she has that opportunity, is going to be so high, it's going to be hard for her to not.
And truthfully, like I saw things when I was left unattended with my cousins. I have vivid memories of things that I should not have seen. And it's just because we're young.
And that was a different era.
Yeah, I know. That was completely different. Like, we might have had dial-up at that time.
Yeah.
And like, that was on satellite TV. So
we found some channel.
found a channel that we shouldn't have. But we saw things because we were left unattended for too long. I never had anyone have that conversation with me about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I did a post on that, like not your experience, but just in general the other day. And it was like, oh, I had a line on that post that was really powerful. Something about like, we ask, why are our kids watching porn and why are our kids looking at stuff that they shouldn't be? And the question should be, why wouldn't they?
Yeah. That's funny because the last note I have in my book, my notebook here, is if we as parents don't put limits on screens, devices, routers, kids will see things.
Yeah. And we know that.
There is no doubt that kids will see things. So that's why it's important to try and learn how and like understand what your children, they're curious. Devices are like, they know how to use them, and they will find things, whether or not they mean to, they will end up finding something. So it's important to not be, I guess, naive, and to make sure that you are actually setting limits even on the devices themselves. And
having the conversations like we were talking about, right?
Yep.
Because, for example, like our kids go on the bus. The bus is, like in the clients I've worked with, the bus is such a common place for kids to view porn for the first time.
Right.
Because it is unattended in the back. It's kind of a free-for-all, right?
Yep.
And a lot of people now have devices. And
so do you not think that a part of that is, like for us, yeah, maybe there were some people with cell phones when we were on the bus. Maybe.
Yeah. More like iPods.
Yeah, like they might have had an iPod. But again, it wasn't as though you could access that kind of stuff on the bus.
No.
So for us as parents, that's, again, I'm thinking about it, and like I talked about before, it's hard for me to comprehend that these things are problems because that's not the experience that I had. So the experience has changed on the bus, for instance.
And we're still learning, right? Like I feel like by the time our kids are parents,
I think it'll all be different again.
It'll be different, right? So like we're still learning and thinking about this, like, oh yeah, all these teens and youth and kids have access to devices on the bus, right?
Yeah.
It's like up to us to how are we going to protect our kids while they're on the bus or at a friend's house or at a cousin's house in the basement, right? Like we have to be the ones thinking about these things.
Right, but that's hard. It's that situation where you don't know what you don't know. Yeah, maybe logically you should understand that.
Yeah.
But again, it's so different. Like I did crazy shit on the bus. But it's, hard for me in my mind. Now, like it makes sense because we've talked about it. But to pair, yes, there are devices now and we did crazy shit on the bus. So now they're probably going to do crazy shit on their phones on the bus.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, like if we're not like I'm constantly thinking about this kind of stuff, right? But the average person has a million other things on their brain. They're not constantly thinking about this stuff, right?
Got work to do.
I'm only thinking about this all the time because it's also my job. So I think parents, like, give yourself some grace if this is the first time you're kind of thinking like, oh crap, what is my child seeing on the bus? Or, oh, I did give my kid a tablet or a phone on the bus. Like, I'm that parent that gave my kid a phone on the bus and now I'm thinking about this. Like, I think we should end it on a note for those parents because it's a lot of people, right? And this might be a lot of information and you're like, oh boy, I kind of have to change what I'm doing so that I can protect my kids. And there's going to be a lot of big feelings about that.
Yep.
And there will be. Your kid might think you're the most uncool parent in the world because you decided that you're going to put some structure around screens or games in the home, and know that that's okay. You can try and get their involvement a little bit, be like, okay, like we're going to make some changes. There'll be some new rules and boundaries and stuff, and work together with them. But at the end of the day, they do need you to take the lead on that. And you can validate the depth of the feeling that they have, because it will be hard.
Yeah, you're kind of, if that's the case, then you're reverting course. You're changing what you've already decided on, which I can imagine will be very annoying.
Yeah.
Okay, we could probably talk on this for hours, so I'll ask you one more question related to that. So you have, let's talk about slightly older kids. If your child has a device, do you think it's okay to look at what they're looking at?
Yes, with a huge caveat that that is already agreed upon before they have the device.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I would say, I talked to parents about this recently. Their 14-year-old was given a phone. They decided one day to start looking through her text messages without telling her. Read a whole bunch of stuff between like her and a boy. They got all worried. They got angry at her. Well, now she doesn't trust them.
Yep.
So what we want to do is say yes, like when they get to that age, and we're postponing how long it is until they have this.
Yep.
But like, I'm going to give you a phone. But part of having this phone is a contract. Like, I would actually make a contract up with your kid about how the phone will be used and the rules and the parameters around it. Like, if you're responsible enough to have a phone, then you need to have this contract in place. And part of those things might be like, it's not in your room. Like, we leave it on the counter to charge at night. And by 10 o'clock, it's plugged in. This is for the older kids, right? And part of it is at any time, I can go on and look at what you've been texting. It doesn't mean I'm going to. Like, I actually hopefully won't do that. But I need to know that I can come in and...
But is that realistic not to?
I think your child, we need to instill, hopefully by the time they're getting a phone, a bit of a sense of trust in the child. Like, they need to know that there is some trust there and that we're not going to be going on every night at like 7 and scrolling through their messages.
Well, I guess I'm nodding to that, but why wouldn't you?
You can. Like, you can do that. But I do think that, I mean, kids are also smart if they know that you're going to go through, like, I remember a peer of mine growing up, her mom would read her MSN messages every single night at 7. Well, I know exactly what she would do. She would delete half of them every night before 7. You know what I mean? Like, kids are smart. If you're going to have that routine around when you're looking at it, they're going to always just be deleting things really, really quick.
Yeah.
So you'd be better off, like, then you're creating the system where your kid's like, oh, I'll do stuff and I'm just going to delete it. You're better off to like intermittently check it and be like, okay, let's do a phone check. Let's look through it together. Let's see what's on there. But doing it kind of at random times, I think would be better than being like every night at 7, we're going to go through your text together. And I also think for the most part, like, and maybe part of your contract is like any apps that are downloaded, I need to approve.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that I think is taken care of by, let's say we use iPhones. So then if we get our daughter an iPhone eventually, like there's a family, like parental guidance you can put on. So you can have it so that she has to, if she wants to download something, sure, she can hit that, but then it asks for our approval.
Exactly.
So our parents' approval before it can actually be downloaded. And like for things like social media, you should be setting up a parental like guidance account that you have control over. You shouldn't be giving them a full account. And they shouldn't have it until they're of the age that like 16 or whatever the age actually is anyway.
Yeah, I'd say most leading experts are saying like just postpone it as long as you can. And if you do need to get them a phone for whatever reason, like they actually need to have a phone, which I think we say they need to have a phone often much earlier than they actually need to have a phone.
Yeah, for sure.
Get them a simple phone. Like that doesn't have the ability to download all sorts of apps and stuff like that.
So you're saying they have to learn how to text with T9?
Well, that's how we learned how to text, right? I think most experts in the field are just saying prolong it as long as you can. And when you do get them a phone, get them something simple.
Yeah. Didn't Australia just ban like kids 16 and under, something like that on social media. I feel like I saw that.
Yeah. And I do think that we will see that in the next few years. Like, I think more people are speaking up about the impact of screens and social media and all of this kind of stuff. I think we'll start to see more of a wave of like, we need to pull back on how soon we give it. But it's taken a while to kind of get to this point, but it makes sense because it was so new, right? And parents are trying to figure out how to handle it. But yeah, I do think having some sort of contract in place when they do get a phone, and like them knowing that at any time you could go through it, so that it's not a secret and that you're not invading on their privacy by randomly just checking it. But that also keeps them accountable for the stuff that they're doing on their phone, right? Knowing that at any point, mom and dad might come through and look at what I'm doing.
I'll be honest, to me, that sounds like in the perfect world, yeah, that works amazingly. But I have a hard time seeing, I don't know, I have a hard time seeing how like
there's no perfect world. Like I truly think that's why by the time you give your child access to such things, there needs to be a trust built and a foundation of relationship built between you and them, and conversations had about what's safe and unsafe on there. Mm-hmm. Because really the minute you give them that device, like, is the moment that you unlock all of these things for your children.
Yeah, there's
right?
a ton of access to anything.
Be so mindful as to when you give your child access to those things. Because no matter how much you say, I'm going to check your phone, or we're going to have a limit of 10 o'clock at night, or whatever it is, like, you've given your child access to all the things in the world. And it's going to be harder and harder to pull them off that and to rein it back in once they have it. So I think that's why most of the experts are saying, like, wait.
Yeah, right.
Give them a simple phone. And then slowly, like, under your guidance, like any skill, like, they're going to need to learn how to use it in a safe way. And again, I think about this for us, like, comes to like modeling healthy behaviors around phones and stuff like that too.
Yeah, which we aren't necessarily the best models of either.
No, exactly. Like, we could stand to work on that. I think we talked about that in our New Year's podcast. It's like, that's one of our resolutions for the new year.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sure we could talk more on this, but we're already at over an hour on this discussion, so we'll cut it off. But
yeah, let us know if you want more. I feel like social media and like the older kid stuff, that's a whole podcast on its own too.
Yeah, I know we have been asked by a certain social media company to allow their one of their main directors of youth and whatever to come on.
Yeah,
but I don't know how valuable of a conversation that would actually be.
Yeah, Scott and I are a little unsure about bringing a guest on who's going to try and talk about how social media is like, we're doing good things for teens.
Yeah. No part of it is good unless you're going to fully ban teens. So.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where we're at on that. Anyway, thank you all for listening. I hope that this helped. I think this was a really valuable episode.
Hopefully we gave some decent tips on what to do and what not to do.
So wait, Scott and I are going to be getting called to talk to people about video games and screens and stuff.
What do you mean? Called to talk about?
Yeah, like, I don't know. I could see people wanting you to speak on this topic more.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anything I could talk on,
it's this.
With some level of expertise, it's probably video games.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Maybe 3D printing, but I don't feel like I'm an expert on that, so.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Hey, thank you so much for being here and listening to this episode today. It means the world to us to have you here. If this conversation was helpful for you, it would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe. That just shows us if the conversation is meaningful and helpful and helps it get out to more people. Also, I just wanted to let you know that every week we have a new episode drop, and if you want to be notified when that happens, just hit the little bell icon. Again, thank you so much for being here, and we'll talk to you again next week.